You ever seen a man stand so still, it makes a whole training ground feel wrong? The question came low, almost lost beneath the dry Texas wind that swept across Range 14, carrying dust, heat, and the restless energy of 50 new recruits trying to prove they belonged. Boots crunched against gravel, instructors barked orders, and somewhere beyond the firing lanes, an old man stood by the chain-link fence like he had nowhere else to be, hands tucked into the pockets of a worn canvas jacket that had seen more years than any of the recruits on that field. Private Cole Ramirez noticed him first, not because the man moved, but because he didn't. While everything else shifted and shouted and performed, the old man simply watched, his pale eyes tracking the range flags fluttering in 3 different directions as if they were telling him something no one else could hear. Ramirez smirked, nudging the guy next to him. "Hey, check it out, base got a new ghost." A few of the others followed his gaze, laughter rising quick and sharp. The kind that comes easy when you're 20 years old and certain you understand the world. They saw an old civilian in outdated clothes, maybe lost, maybe confused, definitely out of place. What they didn't see was the way the man's stance never shifted, weight balanced just enough to react if needed, or the way his breathing stayed slow and measured despite the chaos around him. Ramirez stepped forward, confidence rolling off him like heat off asphalt. "Sir, this area's restricted," he called out, voice loud enough for his buddies to hear. "You looking for the museum, or just got turned around?" More laughter, louder this time, echoing across the open field. The old man turned his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the voice, but not enough to engage, his gaze passing over Ramirez like he was just another moving object in a crowded space. That, more than anything, irritated him. People reacted to authority, to tone, to presence. But this man didn't. "Hey," Ramirez pushed, stepping closer, boots kicking up dust. "I'm talking to you." Still nothing, just that same quiet observation, like the man was studying something far more important than a group of loud recruits trying to establish dominance. One of the others chimed in, mock saluting. "Careful, man, he might outrank you." The joke landed, drawing another round of chuckles, but it carried an edge now, something slightly forced, because the longer the old man stood there, unmoved, the more the atmosphere began to shift in ways they couldn't explain. A few yards away, Sergeant Daniel Brooks had been watching the exchange from the shade of a supply truck, arms crossed, expression unreadable. He'd seen this before, not the situation, not the faces, but the pattern, the stillness, the quiet refusal to engage, the way the old man's eyes kept drifting back to the flags, reading the wind like it was second nature. Brooks frowned slightly, something tugging at the back of his memory, something he couldn't quite place. Back on the line, Ramirez reached out, not aggressive, not yet, but dismissive, gesturing toward the exit gate. "Look, old man, training's underway, you can't be standing here, so let's go." His hand hovered in the air, waiting for a reaction that never came. Instead, the old man's gaze lifted past him, scanning the horizon for a brief moment, as if measuring distance, timing, something invisible to everyone else. Then, finally, he spoke, voice low, steady, and completely unaffected by the tension building around him. Wind shifting, just 3 words, calm and matter-of-fact, but they landed strangely in the noise of the range, like they didn't belong to this moment at all. Ramirez blinked, caught off guard, then scoffed. "Yeah, no kidding, Grandpa. It's cold weather." More laughter, but thinner now, less certain. Brooks straightened slightly in the distance, eyes narrowing, because that wasn't a guess, and it wasn't random. There were 3 flags on that range, each moving differently, and the recruits had been struggling with it all morning. The old man hadn't looked at them directly, yet somehow he'd read all of it in a glance. Something was off, and Brooks felt it settle heavy in his gut, like a memory just out of reach. He reached for his radio, hesitated for half a second, then keyed it quietly. Stepping further into the shade, "Command, this is Brooks on Range 14. I need a quick check on a name." His voice low, controlled, careful not to draw attention. "Arthur Hayes." He paused, eyes still fixed on the man by the fence. "Just run it." The radio in Sergeant Brooks's hand crackled once, then went silent again, the kind of silence that was not empty but waiting, heavy with something just beneath the surface, and he felt it settle deeper in his chest as he watched Arthur Hayes stand there, unmoved, while the recruits continued to circle him like they were trying to provoke a reaction that refused to come. Out on the line, the heat shimmered off the packed dirt, distorting the horizon in slow waves, and Ramirez wiped a sleeve across his forehead, irritation now replacing amusement, because the old man was not playing along, not arguing, not leaving, just existing in a way that made everything feel slightly off balance. You deaf or something? Ramirez pushed again, stepping closer, his shadow cutting across the man's boots. I said you cannot be here, one of the recruits behind him added, louder, maybe he thinks this is some kind of show, and another chimed in, yeah, maybe he is waiting for someone to salute him. The laughter came again, but it did not carry as far this time, swallowed by the dry wind and something else none of them could name. Arthur's eyes shifted briefly, not to Ramirez, but back to the flags, 3 of them, stretched across the range at different distances, each telling a slightly different story, and for a moment his fingers flexed inside his pockets, subtle, controlled, like muscle memory waking up and then settling again. Wind is crossing left at about 8 miles per hour near the berm, he said quietly, almost to himself, but it drops halfway. The words hung there, not loud, not demanding attention, but precise in a way that did not belong to guesswork. One of the recruits snorted, oh. Now he is giving us advice. Ramirez shook his head, a grin returning but tighter now. Appreciate it, old-timer, but we have actual instruments for that. He tapped the digital device strapped to his wrist. We do not need folklore. A few nods, a few smirks, but in the back of the group, one recruit shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the distant target where their shots had been missing all morning, not by much, but enough to matter. Brooks exhaled slowly, thumb pressing against the side of the radio, waiting, counting seconds without realizing it. Then finally the line came alive again, not loud, not urgent, but controlled in a way that immediately sharpened his focus. Brooks, say that name again. Brooks straightened slightly, turning his back to the range. Just enough to shield the conversation. Arthur Hayes, a pause, longer this time, and Brooks could hear faint movement on the other end, papers shifting, a chair scraping. Then the voice returned, lower now, stand by. The connection did not drop, it stayed open, and that alone told Brooks everything he needed to know. Back on the field, Ramirez had reached the edge of his patience. The performance was no longer funny. It was becoming uncomfortable, like a joke that had gone on too long. Without landing, all right, that is enough, he said, voice firm now, stepping in closer. You are leaving, now. His hand lifted again, closer this time, not grabbing, but guiding, asserting control in the way he had been trained to do. Arthur finally looked at him fully, and for the first time, Ramirez felt it, not fear, not even intimidation, but something deeper, like being seen completely and dismissed just as easily, and it made his jaw tighten without him understanding why. A gust of wind rolled across the range, stronger this time, snapping the nearest flag hard to the right while the far one barely moved, and Arthur's gaze followed it instinctively, calculating, measuring, then settling again as if confirming something only he could read. Brooks turned back toward them, radio still in hand, eyes locked on the old man, the unease in his chest now solid, undeniable, because whatever answer was coming through that line, it was taking longer than it should, and in his experience, that only happened when someone far above his level had just stopped what they were doing to listen. The moment Ramirez's hand moved closer, the air seemed to tighten around it, not because of anything the old man did, but because of everything he did not do. No flinch, no step back, no shift in posture, just that same quiet stillness that now felt less like passivity and more like control. Do not make this difficult, Ramirez said, his voice lower now, stripped of the earlier humor, because somewhere beneath the surface, instinct was beginning to push against his confidence, and he did not like it. Arthur Hayes looked at the hand for a brief second, then back at Ramirez, his expression unchanged, but his eyes held something steady and immovable, like bedrock beneath shifting sand, and when he spoke, his voice carried just enough weight to cut through the noise around them. You are standing in the wrong place. Ramirez blinked, caught off guard. What? Arthur did not raise his voice, did not explain. He simply shifted his gaze past the recruits toward the far end of the range, where the heat shimmer bent the light and the distant steel targets sat almost invisible against the terrain. Your line is drifting, he added quietly, as if stating a fact no one else had noticed. One of the recruits laughed, quick and sharp, trying to pull the moment back under control. Yeah, sure. And you can see that from here. Another shook his head. This guy thinks he is some kind of expert. but the words felt thinner now, less certain, because even as they spoke, a faint metallic ping echoed from downrange, not from a clean hit, but from a glancing impact that none of them had predicted. Brooks's radio crackled again, louder this time, cutting through the moment like a blade. Brooks, who else is with him? The voice on the other end was no longer casual, it was focused, controlled, and very, very awake. Brooks turned slightly, eyes never leaving. Arthur, he is alone. A pause, then the reply came, slower, deliberate, keep him there. Brooks felt his grip tighten on the radio. Sir, the answer came back with a subtle shift in tone, one that carried authority far beyond his immediate chain of command. Do not let him leave. Back on the line, Ramirez had had enough, the situation slipping in a way he could not define. All right, that is it, he said, stepping forward fully now, closing the remaining distance. You are done standing here. His hand reached out again, closer than before, fingers extending toward the old man's arm. Arthur did not move away, but something changed, not in motion, but in presence, like a line had been drawn that no one else could see but everyone could suddenly feel, and Ramirez hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, long enough for doubt to flicker through his mind before he pushed past it. The wind shifted again, stronger now, rolling across the range in a low, steady sweep that pulled dust into the air and snapped all three flags in different directions at once, and Arthur's eyes followed each one in sequence, near, mid, far, calculating without effort, remembering without trying. You are reading the first flag, he said calmly, looking back at Ramirez, but the bullet travels through all three. The words landed heavier than they should have, not because of volume, but because of certainty. Behind them, one of the recruits lowered his rifle slightly, glancing toward the targets, then back at the flags, something clicking in his mind that he could not quite articulate. Brooks stepped out from the shadow of the truck now, moving closer, not intervening yet, but no longer. Observing from a distance, his instincts fully engaged, every detail aligning in a pattern he recognized but could not yet name. The radio in his hand buzzed once more, and this time the voice did not wait. Brooks, confirm his appearance. Brooks swallowed, eyes scanning Arthur quickly. Elderly male, mid-80s, white hair, civilian clothing. A pause, then quietly, almost carefully, he added, he does not look like much. There was a brief silence on the line, and when the voice returned, it carried something new, something that made Brooks straighten instinctively. He never did. For a brief moment, no one moved, not because they were ordered to, but because something invisible had settled over the range, a quiet pressure that made every sound feel slightly out of place. The crunch of boots, the distant clink of metal, even the wind itself seemed to hesitate between gusts. Ramirez's hand remained suspended in the air, close enough to make contact, but no longer certain it should, and that uncertainty, small as it was, spread through the line like a ripple no one acknowledged. You think you are funny, Ramirez said finally, but the edge in his voice had dulled, replaced by something tighter, something defensive. You are not in charge here. Arthur Hayes did not respond immediately, his gaze drifting once more across the range, not dismissing Ramirez, but simply not prioritizing him, as if the man in front of him was just one variable in a much larger equation. When he spoke again, his voice was calm, measured, and entirely unconcerned with the tension around him. That is correct, he said, and for a second Ramirez thought he had won something, until Arthur added, but neither are you. The words landed without force, but they held, settling into the silence that followed. A few of the recruits shifted their weight, exchanging quick glances. The earlier laughter, now completely gone, replaced by a quiet discomfort they could not explain. Brooks stepped closer, now fully within earshot, his presence subtle but grounding, the kind of authority that did not need to announce itself, and his eyes remained fixed on Arthur, searching, measuring, comparing what he saw with something stored deep in memory. The radio in his hand buzzed again, sharper this time, and he turned slightly, bringing it closer to his ear. Brooks, the voice came through, no longer distant, no longer casual. Is he still there? Brooks did not take his eyes off the old man. Yes, sir. A pause, then the next words came slower, deliberate. You will maintain position and ensure he is not disturbed. Brooks's brow tightened slightly. Sir, the recruits are. The voice cut in, not louder, but absolute. That is an order. The line went quiet, but the weight of it remained. Brooks lowered the radio slowly, the pieces now aligning in a way that made his chest feel heavier. Because orders like that did not come down for nothing, and they did not come down for no one. Back on the line, Ramirez exhaled sharply, trying to reclaim control of a situation that was slipping through his fingers. "All right, listen," he said, stepping back half a pace, recalibrating. "You want to stand here and talk about wind, fine, but you are not interfering with training." He gestured toward the firing line. "We have a schedule to keep." Arthur gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. Then his eyes shifted briefly toward one of the rifles resting nearby, its barrel angled slightly off from the others, almost imperceptible unless you knew what to look for. "Your zero is off by half an inch," he said quietly, not pointing, not explaining, just stating it as if it were obvious. The recruit nearest the rifle frowned, glancing down at it, then back at Arthur, confusion flickering across his face. "Because that was not something you guessed from 30 yards away." "You did not even see me shoot," the recruit muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Arthur's gaze returned to the horizon. "I did not need to," the answer came, simple, final. Brooks felt it then, that shift from suspicion to certainty, not about who the man was, but about what he was not, and what he was not was ordinary. The wind picked up again, stronger now, carrying a low hum across the range as if the ground itself was holding its breath, and somewhere beyond the berm, a distant engine sound began to rise, faint at first, almost lost in the heat and dust, but growing steadily, approaching with purpose, and Brooks's eyes flicked briefly toward the far access road before returning to Arthur Hayes, because whatever was coming, he already knew it was not routine. The distant engine grew louder, no longer a background hum but a defined presence rolling across the flat Texas terrain, low and steady, the kind of sound that carried authority without needing to announce it, and one by one, heads began to turn, not because they were told to, but because something in that sound pulled attention like gravity. Ramirez glanced over his shoulder, irritation flickering again. "What now?" he muttered, more to himself than anyone else, but the words lacked conviction. Because even he could feel it, that subtle shift in the atmosphere that had nothing to do with the wind. A dark vehicle crested the far access road, sunlight flashing briefly off the windshield before settling into a steady approach, dust trailing behind it in a long, controlled plume, not fast, not urgent, but deliberate, and that made it more noticeable, not less. Brooks straightened fully now, posture tightening without conscious thought, his instincts aligning with something deeper than protocol, because vehicles like that did not arrive without reason, and they certainly did not arrive quietly. Beside the fence, Arthur Hayes did not turn, did not acknowledge the approaching sound, his gaze still resting somewhere beyond the range, as if whatever was coming was already accounted for, already understood, and that calm, more than anything else, made the moment feel heavier. Ramirez shifted his stance, crossing his arms, trying to reclaim a sense of control as the vehicle drew closer. "Training does not stop for traffic," he said, louder now, projecting confidence for the benefit of the others, but a few of the recruits were no longer listening, their eyes tracking the vehicle as it slowed near the edge of the range, tires crunching softly over gravel before coming to a precise stop. The engine cut, and for a second, the silence that followed felt louder than anything before it. The driver's side door opened first, then the rear, and two uniformed personnel stepped out, their movements efficient, practiced, not rushed but exact, the kind of precision that did not come from routine tasks. Brooks felt his pulse shift, not faster, but sharper, as he took in the details, the insignia, the posture, the way they scanned the area, not with suspicion, but with purpose. One of them spoke briefly into a radio clipped at his shoulder, voice too low to carry. Then both turned toward the range, their attention locking onto a single point. Without hesitation, Arthur Hayes, the recognition was immediate, unmistakable, and Brooks felt it land in his chest like a confirmation of everything he had been sensing since the beginning. Ramirez noticed it too, though he did not understand it, not yet, only that the focus of these men, whoever they were, had nothing to do with the recruits, nothing to do with the training schedule. It was fixed entirely on the quiet figure by the fence. "You expecting someone?" Ramirez asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it, directed at Arthur but receiving no answer, only that same steady silence. The two men began walking forward, boots steady against the gravel, their pace measured, unhurried, but carrying an unmistakable weight that seemed to push the air aside as they moved, and with every step, the balance of the situation shifted further, pulling attention, pulling authority, pulling everything toward a center that had not been visible just Minutes before, Brooks took a half step forward, not to intervene, but to align himself, his role changing without being told, because whatever was about to happen, it was no longer a routine interaction on a training range. The wind eased for a brief moment, the flags settling just enough to hang between directions, and in that pause, in that thin slice of stillness, every eye on the field was drawn to the same place, the same man, the same quiet presence that had not moved since the beginning. As if the entire scene had been building toward this exact moment without anyone realizing it until now. The two uniformed men stopped just short of the firing line, their presence alone enough to draw a clear boundary between what had been happening and what was about to happen, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, their eyes fixed on Arthur Hayes with a level of recognition that did not need to be announced. One of them, a senior officer with a crisp posture and a calm, controlled expression, took a single step forward, his boots settling firmly into the gravel, and raised his hand slightly, not in command, but in quiet acknowledgement. "Sir," he said, the words simple, precise, and completely devoid of hesitation. The effect was immediate and absolute. Ramirez froze, not because he understood, but because something in the tone of that single word stripped away every assumption he had made up until this point. The recruits behind him went still, their earlier confidence collapsing into silence as the weight of the moment pressed down on them. Brooks felt it too, that final confirmation, the last piece clicking into place, and he straightened instinctively, his posture aligning without conscious thought. Arthur Hayes turned his head slightly toward the officer, giving a small nod, not formal, not exaggerated, just enough to acknowledge the respect being given, as if it were something familiar, something expected but never demanded. The officer held that moment for a fraction of a second longer, then stepped aside, creating a clear line of space between Arthur and the rest of the range, a gesture subtle but unmistakable in its meaning. Ramirez's mouth opened slightly, words forming but not coming out, because there was no script for this. No training that covered what to say when the entire hierarchy you believed in shifted without warning. Who is he?" one of the recruits whispered, the question barely audible but heavy enough to carry through the silence. Brooks did not answer, not because he did not know, but because he understood that the answer was no longer something that needed to be spoken aloud. The radio at his side crackled once more, and this time the voice came through with unmistakable clarity. "General Whitaker is en route. Arrival in less than 2 minutes." Brooks's grip tightened slightly, but his face remained composed. "Understood," he replied quietly. The words did not travel far, but they did not need to. The name alone, spoken even that softly, shifted the air again. Ramirez heard it, and this time there was no confusion, only a slow, dawning realization that whatever situation he thought he was managing had already moved far beyond him. His posture changed without him noticing, shoulders pulling back, stance tightening, not out of discipline, but out of instinct, the same instinct that tells you when you are standing in the presence of something greater than yourself. Arthur remained exactly where he had been from the beginning, hands still in his pockets, gaze calm, unhurried, as if none of this was surprising, as if the arrival of authority was not a turning point, but simply the next step in a sequence he had already lived through countless times before. The wind moved again, softer now, carrying the faint scent of dust and sun. Warmed metal across the range, and for the first time since the confrontation began, no one laughed, no one spoke out of turn, no one tried to reclaim control. They simply stood, watching, waiting, and slowly beginning to understand that the quiet man by the fence had never been out of place. It was them who had failed to see where they were standing. The sound reached them before the vehicle came into view, a second engine, deeper, heavier, rolling across the range with a presence that did not ask for attention but commanded it anyway, and this time no one mistook it for routine. Heads turned in unison, not out of curiosity, but out of instinct, the kind that had been drilled into them since day one, the kind that recognized authority long before it was seen. The vehicle appeared over the same rise, larger, darker, moving with a steady confidence that seemed to slow the world around it, dust lifting behind it in a controlled wake before settling again as it came to a precise stop beside the first. No one spoke, even Ramirez, who had filled every silence earlier, stood rigid now, eyes fixed forward, jaw tight, as if any movement might break something he did not yet understand. The door opened, and General Robert Whitaker stepped out, his uniform immaculate, his posture straight without effort, his presence carrying that rare weight that did not come from rank alone but from years of being followed without question. Brooks felt it immediately, his body snapping to attention before his mind even processed the motion, and around him, the recruits followed, slower, less certain, but pulled into alignment by something deeper than discipline. Whitaker did not acknowledge them, not at first, his gaze already fixed on a single point beyond them. And as he began to walk forward, each step measured, unhurried, the space between him and Arthur Hayes seemed to draw tighter, like the entire range had narrowed to a single line. The two officers who had arrived earlier stepped aside without a word, creating a clear path, their movements precise, respectful, leaving nothing to interpretation. The wind eased again, just enough to let the flags hang in a momentary stillness, and in that quiet, every sound sharpened. The faint crunch of gravel under the general's boots, the distant hum of heat rising off the ground, the controlled rhythm of breath from the men standing in formation. Ramirez felt it in his chest now, not confusion anymore, but something closer to realization, a slow, unavoidable shift that made everything he had said, everything he had assumed, feel smaller with every step the general took. Whitaker stopped a few feet in front of Arthur Hayes, close enough to see every detail, the worn jacket, the steady eyes, the stillness that had never broken from the beginning. For a brief second, neither man spoke, and in that silence, something passed between them that no one else could fully understand, recognition, history, something deeper than rank or title. Then, without hesitation, without performance, General Whitaker drew himself to full attention, the movement sharp, deliberate, and unmistakable, and in a voice that carried across the entire range, clear and absolute, he spoke a single word, "Sir." It landed like a shift in gravity. The recruits did not move, did not breathe, because in that moment, everything they thought they understood about hierarchy, about authority, about who stood above whom, had just been rewritten in a single, quiet line. Brooks held his position, but inside, the confirmation settled fully, solid and undeniable, because respect like that was not given lightly, and it was never given without reason. Arthur Hayes met the general's gaze, then gave a small nod. The same calm acknowledgement he had offered before, unchanged, unaffected by the magnitude of what had just happened, as if this, too, was simply another moment passing through a life already lived far beyond what anyone here could see. And across the range, under the weight of that single word, 50 recruits stood in absolute silence, finally understanding that the man they had dismissed had never needed to prove anything at all. For a long moment after the word left General Whitaker's mouth, nothing followed it, no explanation, no introduction, no justification, just silence, deep and complete, the kind that settles over a place when something undeniable has just occurred and no one is ready to break it. The recruits stood frozen in their positions, shoulders squared, eyes forward, but their focus had shifted entirely, no longer on drills or targets or instructions, but on the quiet man who had not moved an inch from where he first stood. Ramirez felt the weight of it more than anyone, not because he understood everything, but because he understood enough to realize that every word he had spoken earlier now echoed back at him with a different meaning, sharper, heavier, impossible to ignore. His throat tightened slightly, and for the first time since the confrontation began, he did not try to speak. General Whitaker lowered his salute slowly, but his posture remained firm. His attention still fixed on Arthur Hayes with a level of respect that carried through every detail of his bearing. "We have been looking for you," the general said, his voice steady, controlled, but carrying something beneath it, something personal that did not belong to formal protocol. Arthur tilted his head slightly, not surprised, not impressed, just acknowledging the statement as it was. "You found me," he replied quietly. The simplicity of the exchange only deepened the silence around them, because there was no performance in it, no attempt to elevate the moment, just two men speaking as if the presence of 50 stunned recruits and a full command structure meant very little. Brooks remained at attention, but his eyes shifted briefly toward the recruits, watching the realization spread across their faces in different ways, confusion giving way to understanding, understanding giving way to something closer to respect, and in some cases, quiet embarrassment. One of the younger recruits swallowed hard, his grip tightening slightly on his rifle as if grounding himself in something familiar. Something that still made sense. The wind moved again, softer now, brushing across the range in a low, steady sweep, and this time no one misread it, no one joked, no one dismissed it, because every small detail had taken on a different weight. General Whitaker took a half step closer, not to assert authority, but to close the distance in a way that felt deliberate, respectful. "Sir, command would like to request your presence," he said. The wording careful, precise, not an order, but a request, and that distinction did not go unnoticed by anyone listening. Arthur's eyes moved briefly across the line of recruits, not lingering, not judging, just observing, and for a second, Ramirez felt that gaze pass over him, not harsh, not condemning, but clear, and it was enough to make him straighten further, his earlier arrogance replaced by a quiet, unspoken acknowledgement of something he had not understood until now. Arthur gave a small nod. "I have some time," he said. His voice unchanged, still calm, still steady, as if agreeing to something simple, something ordinary. Whitaker inclined his head slightly in return, a gesture of respect rather than authority, then stepped back just enough to allow space, the same way the others had done before him. No one rushed forward, no one filled the silence with unnecessary words, because there was nothing left to prove, nothing left to establish. The hierarchy had already been revealed, not through rank displayed or commands given, but through a single word and the way it had been spoken. Brooks exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest easing just enough to settle into clarity, because moments like this did not happen often, and when they did, they stayed with you, reshaping the way you understood everything that came after. And across the range, under the wide, sunlit sky, 50 recruits stood in absolute stillness, not because they were ordered to, but because they had finally learned something no drill instructor could have taught them, something that did not come from manuals or commands, but from witnessing, in silence, what real authority looked like when it did not need to announce itself. Arthur Hayes turned slightly toward the waiting vehicle, not with urgency, not with hesitation, but with the same measured calm that had defined every moment since he first appeared at the edge of the range, and as he took his first step forward, the shift was subtle yet unmistakable, as if the entire space adjusted around him rather than the other way around. General Whitaker moved with him, half a step behind and to the side. Not leading, not directing, but accompanying, a position chosen with intention, one that spoke louder than any explanation could have. Brooks held his stance until they passed, then lowered his gaze briefly, a small, controlled acknowledgement that carried the weight of everything he had just witnessed. The recruits remained frozen, but now it was not confusion that held them in place, it was understanding, incomplete but undeniable, the kind that settles in slowly and stays. Ramirez stood at the front of the line, shoulders squared, eyes forward, but his focus was no longer on maintaining authority, it was on processing what had just happened, replaying every word, every gesture, every assumption he had made, and realizing how quickly it had all unraveled without a single raised voice. As Arthur passed him, there was no pause, no correction, no reprimand, just that same quiet presence, and for a brief second, Ramirez felt the absence of judgment more strongly than any confrontation could have delivered. It left a space, a silence that demanded reflection rather than defense. The wind moved again, steady and even, and this time when it brushed across the flags, several of the recruits glanced at them instinctively, not out of habit, but with a new awareness. Reading something they had ignored before, near the vehicle, one of the officers opened the rear door, stepping aside with a respectful nod, and Arthur gave a slight incline of his head in return before pausing just long enough to look back once more across the range, not searching, not lingering, simply taking in the scene as it now stood, quiet, aligned, changed. Brooks noticed it, that final glance, and understood it for what it was. Not a farewell, not a statement, just a confirmation that the moment had passed and left its mark. Arthur stepped into the vehicle without ceremony, and Whitaker followed, the door closing with a soft, solid sound that seemed to echo longer than it should have. The engine started, low and controlled, and the vehicle began to move, turning smoothly back toward the access road, dust rising briefly before settling again into stillness. No one spoke as it disappeared over the rise. No one broke formation, because the silence that remained was not empty. It was full, carrying something heavier than orders or instruction. Brooks finally exhaled, a slow release of tension that had built from the first moment he noticed the man by the fence, and he glanced once more at the recruits, seeing the shift clearly now, the arrogance replaced by something quieter, something more grounded. Ramirez swallowed, then straightened slightly, not to regain control, but to realign himself with a standard he had only just begun to understand. The range remained the same, the targets unchanged, the drills waiting to continue, but something fundamental had shifted beneath it all, something that would not reset with the next command, and as the wind carried softly across the open ground, moving the flags and patterns they could now begin to read, a realization settled in without words, steady and lasting. That respect was never about who spoke the loudest or stood the tallest, but about what endured long after the noise had faded, and those who understood it did not need to ask for it, because it was always recognized when it mattered most.